All right, I think we'll get started. Everyone, warm welcome to you. Welcome to the Center for the Study of Sexual Culture and today's event, Becoming Ungovernable, Trans Life Against the State. I'm Mel White-Chen, I'm director of the center and an associate professor of the Department of Gender and Women's Studies. And I also want to make sure to thank Fernanda Cunha, who's helping to run this event and making everything possible, all the social media that you've seen. So I can't wait to introduce Eric Stanley and Jemma DeCristo, but I do want to quickly tell you a bit about the center and welcome your future involvement. So the Center for the Study of Sexual Culture has been on campus since 2004, and we're interested in all aspects of sexuality, but particularly with life-affirming attention to the intersections, such as queer color strategies, activism, and creativity. We have a conference occasionally. You can find the archives for a 2018 conference, Everybody This Time, on our website at cssc.berkeley.edu. And for this coming year, we're prospectively planning a letter chain project followed by an in-person conference, but with online components at the very end of this calendar year, conditions permitting. And we've had quite the year, so we're just trying to put some things in place. We also host two ongoing groups, working groups in disability and sexuality and queer of color theories and politics. So please contact us at cssc.berkeley.edu if you're interested in participating. Our next event is pretty soon. It's a talk by Ramzi Fawaz on April 22nd from 3 to 5. It's called Queer Love on Barbary Lane, the Sexual Politics of Serial Gay Fiction in Armistead Maupin's Tales of the City. Okay, with no further ado, I want to introduce our speakers today very briefly. Eric Stanley is a cherished colleague and an assistant professor in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies at Berkeley. They're the author of Atmospheres of Violence, Structuring Antagonism, and the Trans Queer Ungovernable. This is forthcoming at Duke University Press, and fingers crossed, September 25th, so mark your calendars. Eric is also the co-editor of Trapdoor, Transcultural Production and the Politics of Visibility, and Captive Genders, Transembodiment and the Prison Industrial Complex. These are both true crossover texts, which many of us know well. And I think as an assistant professor, Eric has already made such a huge mark on trans scholarship, abolitionist work, and so much more. So I'm so thankful to have them here. Jemma DeCristo, who will be in conversation with Eric, is an assistant professor in American Studies at the University of California, Davis. Her current book project, which sounds exciting and important, Blackness in the Writing of Sound in Modernity, tracks and imagines a legacy of Black sonic experimentation in artists ranging from Bessie Smith to Roscoe Mitchell that emerges out of Black music's refusal and dissemblance of technological modernity's legacies of embodiment and capture. It seems like such a beautiful pairing of your resonant work, just hearing refusal, dissemblance, and ungovernability together. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your work, Jemma, and to this conversation. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. Welcome everyone else. I hope all of you will do what you need to do to take care of yourselves. And if you have any access needs, please feel free to put them in the chat and they'll go directly to me or Fernanda. While the event is ongoing, I think we'll have a bit of a unique format, but if any questions or comments occur to you, just please go ahead and, don't hesitate, put them in the chat. And again, they'll go directly to us and then I will read them as after things open up. So I think, sadly, because of a resurgence of Zoom bombing, this is our approach until things get better or in person. And I'm just really sorry about the fact that we're just going in the opposite direction of what I would really want. Okay, so I think we're gonna have this, it's gonna be a short and sweet event, probably about an hour total, but we'll begin with Eric reading some text, and then Eric and Jemma will engage in conversation, and then we'll have a short break to show the film that is the subject of some of the talk today, and then we'll return to reading and conversation again. And then after that, we'll open up for questions. So again, don't hesitate to put your questions in the chat. All right, so thank you so much. I'll hand it over to Eric and Jemma.
Oh, Thank you so much, Mel, for that incredibly kind introduction. And I also wanted to thank Fernanda for all their labor and all the other invisibilized and visible labor that makes these events happen, right? It's lots of people behind the scenes doing all kinds of work that we oftentimes don't know about. So I really wanted to acknowledge that. And also I wanted to thank Jemma for joining me on this occasion. My been friends for very, very many years now, and
50 years, I think.
50 years, yes.
Maybe it's 55.
So thank you. I'm looking forward to this. And like Mel was saying, you know, I find it tedious to hear myself talk, so I wouldn't want to impose that upon you all too much. And so I am going to read just a little bit from the coda, which is the end of my book, maybe like 5 pages, just so people know what's coming. And then Jim and I will talk, and then we'll watch a very short film, and then I'll read the end of it as well. And we can, open it up and talk. Also, if I start speaking too quickly, because sometimes I do that, just let me know in some kind of way and I'll try to slow down. My other caveat is that I'm in a very precarious setup, and so me attempting to read this is going to be hilarious. We'll see what happens. You'll see people walking by. It's going to be a whole thing.
I used to do that before. I walked by back in the day. Remember when we walked by?
It's true. So we'll see how it goes. I also, like to write in tongue twisters, and then I have to read them out loud. And I'm like, oh God, what did I do? Nonetheless. And so you'll get the kind of context of my book because this is the coda, so I'll unpack it. So I'm not going to do too much of that labor up front because I go through it as I go along. So the coda, becoming ungovernable. And it starts with 2 quotes. The first is, I am not a liberated woman. I'm a transgender woman, and I'm working on becoming liberated as we speak. And that's from Miss Major. Then the second one is, it's easy to be free. It's easy to be alive. And that's from Tourmaline. Against the relentless violence this book has attempted to describe, and the numerous symptoms of a state that wills death as the promise of life, becoming liberated or getting ungovernable might offer a way out, or at least through harm's persistence. Here I have argued that the state's spirit, even in its incisively democratic form, contra to the pervasive screams of liberalism, is not in crisis. Indeed, the endless ways our contemporary moments of empire are able to find new and ever more callous tactics to capture, imprison, and liquidate under the very name of democracy coheres more than it interrupts. In contrast to believing these violations are evidence of its decline, I'm suggesting something much more wicked, a wickedness that must be brought into relief if we are to comprehend, let alone confront it. To restate one of my arguments, racialized anti-trans queer violence is not antagonistic to the democratic state, it is among its foundations, a minor claim that demands the end of the world. To question democracy, even from the left, authorizes suspicious despair and raw hostility directed towards all that give it language. Yet those produced as democracy's debris from the global wars waged under its name to the internal attacks ordered against anyone who dreams of more demands our resolve. This drama was particularly evident in the aftermath of the election of Donald Trump and the subsequent attempts to denounce him and his administration as an outlier in the otherwise smooth space of the United States. The proclamation, "This is not normal," codifies the ringing truth of its own lie. Yet, the architecture of this reclamation, its own performance, enables the force of liberal normativity to pull the center further towards the right in hopes of recovering a now challenged fantasy of protection that was never there for most. Tragically, we are returned to the dreaded cage of realism where less bad becomes the only name freedom can take. My intent here is not to erase the vicious specificity many are living and dying through in the current nightmare misnamed the United States, but what closures come from reading such habituation as rupture. Under siege, the declaration of democracy's crisis restages the fictitious pageantry that it has or might be any other way. As should be apparent, democracy is not my target because I desire towards the totalitarianism of its assumed opposite. I believe it must be rendered suspect precisely because it is that which we miraculously save against itself. In other words, even with the weight of history to tell us otherwise, democracy remains that which we cannot release. It returns time and again via messianic attachment to the belief that freedom is always right around the corner. In part, it's because of the hardness with which the concept sticks from left to right that leads me to investigate how it might also function as our shared poison. From the Greek demos in kratos, democracy, ruled by the people, appears as the antithesis to the non-consent of existing as an object singularly under administration. It also inaugurated a break with the relentless concentration of autocratic rule by redistributing sovereignty outward. C.L.R. James, in his 1956 article from the Correspondence newspaper, which eventually became the shop floor pamphlet, Every Cook Can Govern, a study of democracy in ancient Greece, its meaning for today, looked towards ancient Athens for what he understood to be the epicenter of and possible referent for the direct democracy of the coming post-colonial future. What persists in James's account is an insistence on the promise of Athenian rule while knowing that slavery and the subjection of women were its ground. Throughout his brilliant study, he is, however, unable to resolve this impasse. Instead, he pushes past it by setting it aside. Right at the level of content, his critique of vanguardism that expressed itself as representational versus direct democracy continues to be necessary. Yet what I want to stay with is that Athens remained useful for him while knowing its cruelty. James's reading offers another important insight for the maintenance of a kind of left consensus around the idea of democracy. If both anti-colonial freedom fighters as well as conservative defenders of empire argue for democracy's necessity, then what is its substance? Related, how does it become a generalized signifier whose sorcery fills it with cataclysmic emptiness? An apparatus, or at least a tactic, that organizes the collective self is necessary for those of us working towards liberation. Yet the idea that democracy is the antithesis of unfreedom becomes so firmly bound that a cavern of its inversion is opened. How, then, do we get free from democracy's affective stronghold so that we might know the promise of its declaration? Democracy's durability is built, at least in part, through its mythic past, which even in ancient Athens was only mythological. Its triumphant narrative becomes retold as the overcoming of domination by an internal force that offers nothing other than deliverance. Democracy, the antidote to monarchical rule and the tyrannical violence it engendered, becomes, for those of us on the side of communal life, a dangerous object to question. Yet the distance between the myth of freedom and the distribution of unfreedom reminds us that for Alexis de Tocqueville to find American democracy, he had to study its prisons. More directly, the violence of abstracted non-representative governing is not remedied by our inclusion in that same system of administration. There has to be more than sovereign or sovereignty's simulacrum. Critics of the US liberal state help show that from the moment of its imposition, which is to say the colonial occupation of indigenous land, it has enacted the idea of the universality of man while also using that category as measure for the exclusion of all beyond the universe of white propertied manhood. From those that bore the original crest of man, the we of the people, the possessed individual, the subject before the law, and so on, its double in the form of near life has always been mandated. This constitutive outside perhaps most spectacularly appears in the same mechanism that denies its own limit, On this bind, Fred Moten elucidates, US democracy is, quote, what exists as crisis management, and on the other hand, as a set of acts, dispossessions, improvisations, collectivities, and gestures that constitutes and will have constituted the crisis, close quote. Autopoetic crisis. Perhaps this is what democracy looks like. So we can maybe stop there and chat a little bit.
All right, thank you for reading that. And I'm unmuted. Okay, good. I just want to say too, this is just to show I'm extra focused. I closed all the online shopping tabs on my computer, Eric, for you. So that's when you next time when you're like, are we really close? So yeah, I have a lot of, we talked about this. These are a lot of things we talk about, I feel like, because we've known each other for so long, 50, 55, 60 years, whatever it is. And the first thing, so I want to ask you some questions about what you set up in the book, kind of, because I'm thinking particularly about this idea of the less bad, you know, and in particular, like the you know, what we saw, and I don't know if everything was in before the election or after, like what we see a lot is this idea of the lesser of two evils narrative, which, you know, now I think most people realize is, you know, not really even a thing. But I want to talk about what are some of the less bads you explore in the book, and that how do we continually misplace our collective interests, or maybe collective needs is a better way to phrase it, in these less bads, and to kind of give some framing things. I mean, the first thing you bring up, and or one of the figures you bring up is, of course, democracy in general, but even the state, right? So like the state and other kinds of formations. I don't know if that's something maybe that's gone into a bit more. Is that something you're thinking with? And then the other thing, and Mel mentioned another work of yours that you collaborated with Tourmaline on, Trapdoor, and I think a lot about how I don't want to say it's like the marketized version of the state, but I do think it kind of is, like how the you know, representation and visibility, which is a very general category, of course, or a general idea, but how visibility kind of also functions, or how do you go more into kind of notions of visibility as part of this less bad or something, like what is visibility offering us? It's a big question, but kind of maybe just thinking in terms of the book, what are some of these less bads that you confront, and how do we continually misplace our our you know, I guess I would say misplace our collective needs, or collective, it doesn't need to be interest, I guess it'd be collective needs.
Yeah, thank you. That's a lot of questions. So I think I mean, to me, the less bad is a kind of, I mean, it doesn't come up that much in the other parts of the book, but the way I kind of think about it is, it's like, you know, a kind of function of the democratic state that always kind of tricks us into begging for the thing we don't want in the first place, right? Because I feel like we're like constantly trapped in this loop, you know, and the kind of, the two kind of strain, and there's more, but the two kind of most prevalent strains around thinking about the democratic state are either that, you know, it's not democratic enough. So that's usually the kind of left progressive, whatever, you know, that we need more direct control, those kinds of things. Then the other one seems to be, you know, from like Plato to the Federalist Papers, right? The fact that it could become too democratic, right? That people could have too much direct control. And I think for me, you know, after many years of this experiment, I'm just asking, and I don't actually know, but this coda, because it is kind of experimental, is asking, what if we are already living at democracy's limit, right? What if we are already inhabiting versus, you know, thinking it's to come, or, you know, like thinking with Derrida or somebody like that. Like it's, you know, there's this idea that it always becomes displaced to this mythic past and this mythic present that we never seem to arrive at, right? And so one of the things I ask is, you know, are there other ways that we could imagine living together that are not constituted, you know, not just by the liberal state, because lots of people like to critique that, and that's fine, right? But that's always because it's not democratic enough. And I'm like, well, let's just go there and see what happens, right? What is the
Bernie
substance?
had one.
Yeah, you know, what is the substance of democracy if everybody's arguing for it? So that's my question that I don't have an answer to. Luckily, I will never be in charge of anything, so I won't really have to face that. But there's that. But yeah, I mean, the question of representation figures really largely in the book, right? The thing, I mean, representation, of course, is always really important because it constitutes and doesn't just represent the world. So I deeply believe, and it's, you know, it's generative power, so it is that, but it also is, again, whatever the concession is that's most readily offered up is always the thing that is probably the least useful. So I think about that in relationship to representation, while also knowing that it's really important, right? I mean, I make movies, I do things, I think it's like important, but you know, so I kind of keep working these double binds, like what do we need and what do we get? And it's kind of a pretty simple equation, but like, what do we need? What do we want? What do we get tricked into thinking that we need? So it's like all those kinds of configurations. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess obviously we, Jim and I have talked about this a lot and we think a lot together. And so I was wondering how you might think about the kind of figure of the less bad as operative.
You know, I mean, I think you kind of said it. Like, I think one of the tendencies, at least the way I tend to think of it, right, is that people, like one of the inherent tendencies I feel like is almost immediately for people to not address what their needs are, right, even in kind of collective organizing, and adopt the assumption that whatever the system is that they want to even, let's say, fight against in a general sense, needs to be maintained, or that it needs to be addressed, even for that matter. I think that's even part of like kind of what you're getting at, right? So I think, I mean, representation is, of course, I think more like extreme like that, because we're literally, you know, we're literally vested with like, I saw someone say this yesterday, where they're like, you know, like, I'm gonna tell myself, hopefully no one finds me on social media. I'm sure people laugh. Like, but someone was like, you know, if we had different people in the room with like, you know, when someone like Lena Waithe, I'm thinking of a queer person, makes a show, maybe it wouldn't be so violent towards Black people. And it kind of is very similar to what you said about this projected, like, well, if we keep, I mean, diversity is like this idea, right? Which diversity is kind of the bulwark of like oppressive neoliberal, you know, multiculturalism, among other things. And I feel like part of what we don't look at, right, is when we accept those terms, we don't actually look at the like, and I think like you're getting at this on some level. I think it is a function of democracy in a certain kind of way, right? Is that like, you don't realize how much diversity actually exists for those institutions. It actually doesn't exist for anyone. It doesn't help anyone. It actually is directly produced. It's invented to make those institutions, to make the authority of institutions look more legitimate, right? Including the state, right? So like, you know, we have our favorite, what's her name? The cop, Kamala, as the vice president, you know, like it kind of just, it keeps adding, and it keeps expanding the authority of institutions that directly abstract or remove the needs from people. Yeah, so I don't know, that is kind of my, I mean, obviously I'm not gonna say I like the sound of my own voice, but I talk a lot, as Eric knows. So, and a couple other people on, you turned on the camera for that one, a couple other so yeah, like I think there is this sense in which I think there's a tendency to like, and I think it's also kind of like, it's funny, it's sort of a product. One of the things I was thinking about, that you're kind of gesturing towards in what you read and in the book, is like, I feel like it's one of the things we've yet to address, is even the way in which like our notions of care are very democratized, or like very skewed with a kind of notion of populism, like who is more deserving of care, who's, again, it's the language of issues and things like that, who's yeah, whose care serves a greater good, a sense of greater good, which is usually, you know, like tracked along the axis of reifying, like you said, like white male property. So it's like it kind of skews along that hierarchy that we are very familiar with race, class, gender, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, so like I think it's a very deceptive question, and it kind of makes me think a lot about the direct control aspect. And I like to direct control more than direct democracy, or what you're talking about, like how that would actually maybe become kind of a form of being ungovernable, like direct access to one another, direct care with one another, that stops reproducing the demos of democracy. I wanted to, and I think it's actually really related. I'll ask you another question. See, I'm curbing myself. I think about, and we don't have to keep talking about the concept of democracy here, but I think you brought the really good, I feel like people still don't, I think that idea, right, even from de Tocqueville to Athens, this idea that if you look at Athens, it's like, okay, well, democracy quite directly required slavery, and I think you're kind of alluding to this idea that, which we see playing out over and over again, that democracy requires prisons, right? Or maybe would you say that? Is the book kind of getting at this idea? And I could ask in a general way, but I also wanted to pull this quote, research, from CLR James from the essay cited, and I just thought it was really telling, and it makes me think of some of the terms you're working with. So you talk in the first part about how there was this collective cry under Trump, right? This is not normal, right? That kind of thing, where people were like, "This can't happen," or specifically that idea, "This is not normal," which you use that phrasing. And then I think you gloss CLR James, and he has this. I'll try to read the quote quickly and just emphasize the point I want to emphasize, which is, "It is necessary to say this: in the best days of democracy, there were many slaves," we could stop there, but he keeps going, "who, although denied the rights of citizenship, lived the life of ordinary Greek citizens." So ordinary sticks out to me with normal. There were horrible conditions among the slaves who worked in the mines. I'm fast forwarding. But on the whole, the slave code in Athens had been described in by competent authorities as the most enlightened the world has known, right? So I'm thinking about the way in which you use, or I'm thinking in particular about the way you invoke normal, how, maybe CLR James invokes the ordinary life. I mean, this also kind of thinks Lauren Brilliant could be in here sort of too, or something like that. Dean's, I can say you're a good friend, Dean, we're allowed to connect you. Uses normal life, of course, a book that's very much in conversation with, I think, your book. And then your own, one of your own contributions, this idea of near life, and how those kind of, what's the relationship between near life and normal life, or we're supposed to be going back to normal aspirationally, right, or something soon. So like, what's kind of the relationship between those two, that construction of normal or ordinary life and near life that you see that's maybe central to democracy, or making relate to prisons? Or
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the first chapter of the book is about, I try to like think about this concept of near life as a, forms of life that kind of persist nonetheless under extreme forms of violence. The book is obviously about really intense and really awful scenes of anti-trans and anti-queer violence in various ways. But yeah, I mean, I think in a certain sense, right? I mean, one of the, it again, it's not an incredibly intricate claim, but again, the ways in which the kind of, I mean, what I'm interested in asking is, how is it that we continually live with the kind of durational wreckage that is the everyday, right? It's like, I mean, that's really the question. There's more than enough for all of us to have everything we need, yet here we are. Right? The crisis of capitalism is always overabundance. I mean, we can think about materially housing, right? Bay Area, there's over 100,000 empty units, and yet there's 10,000 empty people in San Francisco living on the street tonight. And so the question is like, how is it that we kind of continually live within those conditions? And I think, I don't say in this part, but the way that I think about the state is not actually something that's necessarily external to us, right? It's always a kind of collective projection of our group fantasies almost, right? And because that's how the state maintains its strength. I mean, it maintains its strength through brute force, but also the ways in which we're constantly recreating it, right? And that's kind of what you were talking about, Jemma, the way that like we kind of ask of, in the certain ways that we ask of institutions, we're also asking we're also asking to become institutionalized in a specific and contingent kind of way, right? So I'm kind of thinking about those, that doubling all the time, right? So it's like, the cop in your head, but also the state in your head. So I'm also thinking about that, right? Because I think that there's this, the fantasy that is if the state is always exterior to all of us, relinquishes us of the responsibility to think critically about that, right? It's kind of just a displacement. And it's like, oh, the state's doing this. And it's like, I mean, especially if you believe in democracy, then you're really the state. But nonetheless, so yeah, I mean, I think that, going back to your question of the normal or the everydayness of, again, what I'm calling the kind of, essentially durational terror that people are forced in very different ways to live and die under. And its kind of continued persistence and its escalation, right? So But maybe we should show the little video and then I'll read the end and then we can come back and we have some questions in the chat too, and then we can continue it. Does that sound good to people? Just trying to be aware of time.
Sorry, everybody. Looks like our sound isn't coming across, but I did post the link to the video. It's about 3 minutes long in the chat. So you may want to, if we can't solve this problem, you might want to watch it on your own and then come back here.
Well, hopefully you got a little bit of a taste, but definitely watch it on your own. It's 3 minutes long. It does have some really great music. You know, Zoom technology, what can we do? So I'm going to go ahead and so I referenced the film, so that's why you wanted y'all to maybe see it, but again, go back and see it with the sound on or whatever. So there's a middle part and I cut because of time where I talk about ungovernability as a legal category that gets projected onto trans and queer youth that are existing outside of the bounds of their parental guidance, essentially. And so what usually happens is a trans or queer youth can be doing something and it's usually their parent or guardian that wants them ruled as ungovernable by a kind of family court person, because then it relinquishes the parental responsibility for anything that the youth does. And what that does is oftentimes lands people in juvenile jail or something like that. So there's a part about in the middle, but I cut it because of time. And so I'm going to jump to the end, which talks about this video. So this last part is called Still Fucking Here. I too was an errant youth. By the age of 14, I was precariously housed and had already been expelled from school for the second and final time. I was charged with truancy, which was the name they gave my attempt to escape the extended torment of public education. It was then, as it is now, much easier to banish the survivor and to produce us as the problem of our own making than it is to confront violence's grind. My chronic absence was narrated as disruptive, not because I was actively distracting others, but because I exposed the fragility of that which kept us in class by escaping it. Indeed, their fear was not for me, a fact they emphatically confirmed, but that I might serve as referent for others to join us beyond the school's administration. My refusal to adhere to the lockdown of normativity's drive, expressed as unavoidable injury, was both the punishment for my escape and the catalyst of its persistence. Alone, together, the materiality of my survival was never singular. The intimacy of aid, a sofa, free food, a place to be when there was no other, offered a wayward community, however transitive. Without transcendence, we can't disregard violence's endurance, nor assume flight is always an option. Yet here, I want to hold the beloved network of care that have always helped us learn, as Tourmaline affirms that it's easy to be free. In the quake of her evocative precision, we know our undoing has not yet been undone. On the contrary, it continues to intensify. Nonetheless, radical dreaming affords us the space of ease, which is how we might learn to feel freedom. Among the figures whose freedom dreams have allowed for our shared endurance in a world that wishes otherwise is Miss Major. In the 1990s, Major was working at the Tenderloin AIDS Resource Center, TARC, as a street-level service provider for low-income people in the neighborhood. She drove the outreach van and helped run the needle exchange program that provided clean syringes and other supplies to anyone who asked. Needle exchanges were then, and continue to be, semi-legal operations where direct action and mutual aid meet in the communal knowledge that distributing resources without expectations keeps us alive. Before the massive tech-fueled gentrification of the Tenderloin, it was a space of fugitivity where those cast aside came together to build a life out of the wreckage of latest capitalism. The site of the Compton's cafeteria riots decades before, even under attack, its glorious blight has partially protected it from those who find value in sterility. An unhoused teenager who had, like so many before, sought refuge in the fantasy of San Francisco, I was sitting in the lobby of TARC when a booming laugh broke the ordered chaos of the room. With a swing of a glass door and the slam of box of condoms on the floor, Major was there. Major is multiple. She is a Black trans woman by way of the South Side, by way of Deep East, now Little Rock. In the aftermath of at least 2 bloody uprisings, she was radicalized by Attica survivor Frank Big Black Smith in Dannemore prison and on the streets outside the stone wall. She is the maternal sign for many whose first mothers lost them. Her stories of survival, hooking and boosting, collect a wild history, we're getting by without getting got, grows an ecology beyond the formalism of the state. Insurance scams, fraudulent documents, and ever-changing identifications. Her life on the run brought the world with her, anarchism in action. In 1990 San Francisco, she and most of her girls survived with only scant health care, let alone the coverage necessary to pay for gender-affirming services. Through a dedication to supporting her sisters and daughters, fictitious community college students gleaned financial aid checks for classes never taken to pay for care never otherwise available. Here, ungovernability is not a scene of drifting chaos, where powers account for survival always cuts along difference. That is democracy. It is an organized yet improvisational practice in common that reveals the pleasure, that revels in pleasure and expropriation, whose aim is to collectivize exposure towards that exposure's abolition. Without consent, the mechanisms for being accounted for by being counted against intensify under the surveillant gaze. Democracy is resolved. The walled polis demands your papers. A technology where self-representation is ferociously required to adhere to the genres of state legibility. From public bathrooms and SROs to ICE prisons and airports, identification or its lack often dictates movement or its lack. Many trans organizations remain dedicated to the life-saving tactics of providing gender marker and name changes that are necessary for people navigating bureaucracy's escalation. Having the option to align one's identification under a regime of state surveillance, especially for those held in highly institutionalized spaces like shelters and hospitals, is a reform we cannot not fight for. Along with battling through the violence of administration, democracy's data set reconsolidates the gender binary. Here, by way of boundless accommodation, mainstream LGBT politics has on occasion suggested transitioning from medically imposed gender markers to ever expanding biometrics as criteria for state-issued identification. A deferral of gender as biomedical truth and towards retinal scans as that truth's concretization. This idea has also accumulated the growing consensus that facial recognition's artificial intelligence, AI, technology is unable to accurately identify many trans, gender nonconforming and or non-white people. In response, projects have emerged that demand a democratization of AI that can recognize us all. Equality in and as the gaze of the state. Yet what remains under these attempts to degender identification is that gender normativity and anti-Blackness are designed into the very idea of biometrics. Worse, these demands in turn legitimate biometrics and the state that reads them as the racial and gendered scientific truth and their proliferation, the path to safety. As we continue to expand gender options on IDs, we must also struggle to end the state that issues them as the practice of territorialization. While the state's checkpoints remain, collective indeterminacy, or more precisely, collectivizing the refusal to be known from without, emerges as a tactic of interdiction. Tourmaline's The Personal Things, which we just watched, is a stop motion animated film that layers an interview with Major over the vibrancy of drawings. Opening with a zooming shot of her 1976 Cadillac DeVille, crowned with vanity plates that read, T.S. Cougar. Major announces her cunning irreverence. Major's voiceover declares that, quote, "One of the most exciting things to me today is watching a girl go catch the bus and her shit, you know, it's like, yes." Her joyful laugh cuts through the juxtaposition of the history of how she and other girls could not dress during the day for fear of absolute violence. Detailing the ways Black trans women were targeted by police for, quote, just breathing, she entangles her optimism with an insistence on harm's ongoingness. Wanting to reduce the kinds of administrative harassment she lives, Major changed the gender markers on her identification from the assigned M to F. The camera pans the drawings, creating movement through depth and light, as Major's narration reworks the relationship between the political and the personal. In a radical recasting of the temporality of transition, quote, "I changed all my identification back to male because," I quote, because, quote, "I want people to know I'm a transgender person and love me for that. Fuck this other stuff," close quote. She did not want the state to understand her as a cis woman, and that, quote, "That was my way to strike back. And you know, you have to find your way to strike back." In effect, her striking back was not a desire to further expand the biometric state or for a more democratic census, but to collapse the very conditions of intelligibility that offered nothing other than life subtraction. She's emphatic that such practices are not available to all, nor is she making a claim to realness or a generalizable prescription, but that you have to, quote, "get together and abolish what's going on," but it's the personal stuff that gives you the strength to go forward, close quote. Major's perpetual interruptions and illicit practices, the way she grows a Black trans social life in the ruins of a white world, unsettle the stone precision of the state's biometric drive. This, with the unruliness of trans and queer youth who reject the corporal violence of education and the emptiness of home, undo the pledge of incremental personhood. While the scale at which revolutionary change most often becomes known might miss such minor acts, it is their building of another end of the world, while also allowing for life to fill it, that reminds us that we never struggle alone. Together, our anti-authoritarianism is a force that wildcats the state and the covert practices of skipping school, jumping turnstiles, and counterfeiting documents. Underground, we creep, undetected through the dark alleys of recognition and below the frames of democracy's security cameras. While this book has dwelled for perhaps too long in the space of death, I end with the ungovernable, not because such practices negate violence, but we, those that go on, must hold this incommensurability. If abolition's generativity names a presence of the world as much as it labors to end the one that we cannot survive, then ungovernability not only refutes the state, it also figures the ease of living now. This is not to lay claim to the diminishing of modernity's structuring antagonism. If anything, this is an unfinished experiment in collective action, a recursive dream that builds on itself, as pedagogies of rebellion always do. Yet even in the place of trans queer celebration that is Major's laugh, we are returned to the banks of the River Jordan, where we await Marcia, Sylvia, and all the others who were stolen from a world that could not bear their opulence. It is in this atmosphere of violence where getting ungovernable is both a trace of and a map for becoming liberated as we speak. That's the end of that part. We can either, Jemma, we can talk more. There's also maybe there were some questions and we can open it up
questions. Too. I'm fine. I actually don't, wait, do I not see questions in the chat? I don't have like a special chat, okay. It's up to you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we can, yeah, let's get it.
It's your book.
I mean, no. Sure, if people can put questions in the chat. Mel, that's the best way to do it. Yeah, okay. There's one here.
If not, I can always talk. We know that. Okay.
So there's a question in the chat, and I'm just going to pare it down. It's a really wonderful question about can the state ever realize queer people? And then the second part of it is, when I say become ungovernable, does that mean state institutions are hopeless and cruel? Hopeless and cruel optimism invested in them is futile. I mean, I think, yes, the state can comprehend or realize trans and queer and all kinds of people, and that's kind of the problem. That's one of my arguments. Or it's not singularly a problem, but the way in which it constitutes subjects is the problem. And so I think that, of course, and I think about this, about all kinds of existing in the world when we have bad and worse choices. I think that we can still make demands on the state, something like rent control, right? That's a demand I'm going to make on the state. But towards the idea that there's something beyond the state, and how do we create a practice that opens up that question rather than shuts it down, right? So I'm actually not incredibly prescriptive when I think about these questions, right? I'm like, how can we say, yes, we need this thing that will keep people in their houses, right? The same way I think about prisons, right? How can we do this thing that's going to decrease the intensity and severity of the relentless harm that it causes, while also holding open the possibility for something else. Right? So that's a really great question. Thank you for asking it.
Any other questions? I'm sorry, I'm not sure the chat function is working. We're kind of scanning our chats to see if anything is coming in. If there's any way to get my attention, please let me know. We have some wonderful people here in the room, and yeah, I'd love for the barriers to come down.
Yeah, there's a question here about the Biden's reversal of the trans military ban. You know, I'm of course always for everyone not being in the military and for the end of the U.S. military, right? And the ways in which, you know, as an institution, right, every single person in my family is in the military for like generations, right? Because you get tracked into it through JROTC from the shitty high school that my brother went to the, you know, we all know that story. And so, you know, I think that perhaps more now than ever, it's really important that trans politics always articulates a very clear anti-imperial politics that understands that trans liberation is always bound up in anti-imperialism because, you know, as we know the force of, you know, the United States military and what it does both internally, right, in the imaginary space of the United States and geopolitically, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think that conversation and lifting it up is really important now in particular, right? Because of course, trans people are being used to, in the same way that Jemma was talking about, the diversification of, you know, violent institutions, right? It's, you know, diversity has been being used as a kind of discursive armor to protect it from critique itself, right? So yeah, I think to me, that's a really important conversation to always bring back up, right? And we can see the success of those kinds of campaigns, right? Gays in the military and trans people in the military, because that conversation around the military itself it used to be a kind of generalized, even like middle progressive critique of military, and now it's like kind of somewhat off the table. And I think that that's really scary to me.
Do you have other questions in the chat? I have one if you do not. Okay.
Go for it.
Sarah Jung has a question. How do you kind of reconcile acts of queer joy with capitalism's constant monetization and co-optation of queerness and its artistic expressions?
I mean, I think for me, you know, joy or even like laughter, like all those things. And that's why I actually point to Major's laughter. Like Major's a very hilarious person, right? And that's one of the kind of endlessly charismatic things about her. And her like insistence on pleasure, maybe not joy, but pleasure, right? Sex, right? That's like something that's really important. Her thinking about like world building. So all those things are really important. And I think for me, it's important to not have a kind of purity politics, again, because under, you know, latest racial capitalism, all we have are bad and worse choices. And so how do we steal back? How do we wildcat the totality, the seeming totality, in a way that, you know, sustains us, right? In the same way that Major was talking about the sustenance of, you know, the little trick that she did. Yeah, and so I think that that's actually really important, right? You know, while also, of course, staying somewhat vigilant around the ways in which we are so easily kind of incorporated in those logics, right? And the same kind of critique that Jemma was bringing up around diversification of, you know, logics of, or institutions that are not fundamentally ever going to give us the things that we want or need and actually function to disallow our even asking of those questions.
Wonderful. We have another question. We have two more questions, but I'll just read the first from S.A. Smythe. They'd like to hear how this ungovernability in relation to the state can be thought across borders and languages.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, right, one of the, I guess, I mean, ungovernability just becomes a kind of place to think with, right? So it's not actually a thing, but I think what it does for me is it also, of course, necessarily throws into jeopardy the naturalization of borders themselves, right? Ungovernability is a tactic that, you know, doesn't simply unthink borders, but makes borders unthinkable, I guess. And so, yeah, I definitely think that, yeah. So I definitely, I mean, I think that there's, and SA would know this better than me, but you know, there's so much to think about around the question of borders and territory and, you know, occupation of the land that we're on right now, as of course, always expressions of, you know, a state that again, wills death under the claim of life.
Questions are really streaming in now, so
Oh no.
we have one from Renyo Huang. Hi, Eric. Very generic question, but can you say more about ungovernability in relation to trans BIPOC resistance and to trans BIPOC survival? How are they interrelated or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, right, the ungovernability part is not actually, right, it's actually the condition in which many people have always found life, right? I'm just like giving it a little bit of a moment of form that was probably going to collapse, and that's probably fine too, right? I'm just trying to hold it for the second. You know, and so the way that, you know, Major, like in the film, the way that she, I mean, the story about the possible fraudulent, in the olden days before the hyper surveillance of the biometric state, when you could just like, you know, change all kinds of documents really easily, you know, you could do things like get student loans under all kinds of people's names, right? And there's this like really long and really vibrant history of people having all these really interesting scams as ways to survive. And of course, people shouldn't be forced under those conditions, but I think that there is something about the practice, the materiality of the practice. This is a story that she tells in the documentary about herself called Major. And so I think that there's, you know, to me, something, ungovernability then becomes this way to think about a form of survival or survivance that also disrupts the kind of smooth space of inevitability. So it's doing both of those things to me at the same time. And that's why I think it's so interesting and important. And it also does this other thing, I think, or the way that I'm attempting to think about it is that it collectivizes exposure, right? And so an example of this is, you know, there's in Mexico City, there's a kind of bus riders or a train riders union of people that pay into it, and they jump the turnstiles all the time. Then if one of them get caught, then the money goes to pay that ticket, right? And so it's then about a kind of practice of exposure that collectivizes it in a really, I think, interesting way.
Okay, I have another question for both of you from Avery Wilson. Do either of you feel there is a dying out of queer anarchist activists or radical politics in general? While the Rainbow Coalition from the Black Panther Party is long gone, do you have hope for a united front in the near future, or should our focus be diverted to new forms of organizing?
Do you want to start, Jemma?
You want me to start with that?
Sure.
I don't know. I don't have a strong. I feel like that's a little bit like the "what do we do now" question, which is good. I mean, we're always asking that. I think there is. I think one of the things that's kind of insidious now, I guess for me, it relates to the point that Eric just made, like about ungovernability. Is like I do think it's very deceptive the way that the state and like, you know, I mean, you could, I don't really think there's actually a separation between the state and the market, like why we talk about them as different things. But anyway, just different gods. I think it is very insidious the way in which visibility has been so deeply connected to. I'm not going to answer it so much in terms of the framework of anarchism. Um, I mean, I guess, but I do think so. I do think there is this very insidious way in which visibility has so intensely been appropriated to be a positive good when it's so deeply connect. Like, you know, you bring up the underground, brought up the underground and governability, all these ideas that from the 70s, which is when I think you start to see this sort of happening. You like people actively adopted practices of, you know, yeah, you could call it like stealth, you know, stealth. Sure, I'll say. We're gonna stealthing. Yeah, like people, you know, actively adopted, which is kind of an older anarchist model, I guess, and it does transpose onto queer anarchism. I mean, I don't really have like I guess I would say like more for me like Black anarchism kind of movements, but like I think one thing people ought to do, and it goes back to the refusal point because we do talk about, and we were on a panel, I think, was my word refusal or was called something refusal. I do think like refusing visibility, which is kind of in some cases a small anarchist collective model for things, because I feel like we've seen with like BLM the arc of the failures of visibility, sorry, or at least to me, for so many reasons, and that's its own kind of presentation, but like the visibility of spokespersonship, the visibility of spokespersonship, the visibility of you know, certain kinds of like empty appeal signals and things like that. I do think there's something to be said for like, and I don't know if it'll ever happen. I thought it did happen for a moment in the summer when people were like, stop filming protesters. You know, so it was like, that's even just that, like, oh, it's actually not good to take a picture of every fucking thing every second on your phone all the time and then put it online. It actually has a negative consequence, which it always has, right? And that was, I'm old enough at least to like where that was a little, I grew up a little bit with that. I think Eric probably grew up with more of that, where there was more critique of surveillance culture and surveillance cameras weren't everywhere and things like that. So like, I do think there has to be much like a greater recognition of that, even though it's tough because those apparatuses have become so much bigger and stronger, and our coercion into self-appointing, self-identifying within them, of course, you know, things like social media has expanded so much. But so I do think there is something to be said for kind of different forms of anonymity and invisibility, right? It goes back to the representation thing with like people being like, I want to be represented in this show or this modeling campaign or this category in fashion or this category in whatever. I think there's something to be said for collectivizing and forming collectivity and forming collectives. And, you know, hopefully people are doing this after the summer in ways that don't privilege visibility and spokespersonship and kind of some form of categorical recognition. And I think that has to be conditioned by, because of course Eric and I live in the Bay and we see like the worst version of this is like the white queer anarchists that like will go to you know, it's like an insurrectionary, that's not me, I don't know. So like anonymity with accountability, I think, which has often been lacking in those, which is also why those, a lot of those movements, I think in the Bay, and Eric would have way more of the history in this. I think there is some aspect to why a lot of those movements kind of died out. This is more contemporary in the last 20 years, I think, is that, you know, like I think anonymity can be in its own kind of a certain kind of fetish, right? You don't want to reconstitute like organizing under like the fantasy of omniscience or something like that. Like I don't know if like anonymous that would be a way to characterize something like that, but like, you know, that kind of omniscient authority that I think a lot of white anarchists can in a certain kind of way invoke, and then, you know, their trust fund kicks in and they move out of the Bay and they move into grandma's house back in Cape Cod or whatever. So like that would be an anonymity without accountability. So I think there are ways to build in structures of accountability, which are harder because I think that comes from actually being really deeply rooted in community. And, you know, people now, because of displacement and the things that are brought up around housing and people trying to hustle in the negative sense of it, which I think is the opposite of the history Eric was conjuring with Miss Major, move a lot to places to do better and do better and do better. And they're, you know, they're in Austin now or whatever instead of here or in Portland. So, because it's cheap, which is good riddance, probably, but also, sad because, you know, you don't even have those kinds of groups to the extent that you used to, I don't think. I don't know if that was a long answer again, but that would be my response to it. And I don't know, there's probably some of that is of course taken from Eric too, I'm sure, in our conversations.
Y'all, it's picking up here. And we're reaching, the end of the promised hour. So what I'm going to do is actually share with you the remaining questions, and hope that you'll take them as you will, and that will be that'll be our closing, unfortunately, for the event. I can tell that you're just getting started, but I also promise to have a short and sweet event. So I will also keep my own questions to myself, and hopefully I'll meet you in person, Jemma, someday, and Eric, I can chat with you some other time. But here are the questions from other folks. One from Lawrence Cohen. Thanks, Eric, and thanks, Jemma. This made me unexpectedly animated politically in a way that I have not felt in a while, and I'm so grateful. This is a sort of question. I attended a talk given by a very thoughtful candidate for a Berkeley staff position focused on trans queer student support. And the candidate made an argument that exclusionary data structures particularly hurt trans racialized persons and collectives. And the answer for someone working in a bureaucratic capacity seemed to be the institutionalization of better and more encompassing datafication. So I was taken by your nuanced discussion of data and surveillance and / democracy, and was wondering if you had further thoughts on the moment of data destroys us, data will save us. That's one question. From Jeannie Austin, I've been thinking through the trapdoor of technological visibility, what you phrased as to be seen equal in and seen equally by the eye of the state. Apologies for the misquote. Can you speak to the harsh space of being misidentified by biometric technologies and the real state violence that can follow that misidentification, and the need to resist a techno-utopian carceral state that, quote, better recognizes us? Question for Jemma DeCristo from Shreyas Venkat. Do you think all of these pictures you talk about and social media's expansion have created a new informational simulacrum that keeps movements in only a wave of trend and fetishization? If so, how can we utilize this informational overload and amount of social media we face for real movements instead of facades of ones? And then finally, from Sharad Chari, thanks, Eric. The excerpts you read were so eloquent. I'd like to ask about the sphere of queer mutual aid that you pointed to and its complex relationships to racial capitalism and the state.
Jemma, do you want to start with that question? And then, because a bunch of them were about data, and so I can maybe group those together in some kind of way to end it.
Okay, the one that was asked me was something about I'm really good at memorizing things to a fault. Okay, so the data one, I mean, I don't know the specific context of that, so answering, I think, Lawrence's question. I always think that's, because I teach at university too, I always think it's I think one of the things that's difficult because what, sent to me. Oh, right. Oh, the social media one. Do you want me to answer that one or the data one too? I don't, either one. Okay. Okay. So like the data one, I do think one thing that's I always tell my students is like, well, the university is modeled on siloing you more and more into different forms of management. So like, I think it's kind of tough because, and to do that precisely so it doesn't have to, and it never will, it kind of relates to something Eric said, undo itself, right? So like, I think of the things like in Davis now, one of the biggest things, I'm sure Berkeley must be the same because it's so fucking expensive, is like housing, which of course is disproportionately going to affect Black and brown, trans, and queer students. And I think there is a way in which like, and I try to talk about this with my students without kind of like, I think it's the way in which we actually talked about this yesterday. Is a very complicated issue. I'm happy to take, I'll say this is all me and not there. But I think it's the way in which like, you want to talk about accessibility, right? So like, and data is often misplaced as accessibility, I think, or misconflated with it. And so, you can talk about the management of, which is to say the like transubstantiation of trans students of color into data that does not amount to them actually having housing, which is actually mostly what data is. It's meant to manage people as like an abstracted form of, an abstract idea. It's like an extension of the commodity form. And I think that's really true of places. I'm sure it's true of Berkeley, like Davis, where like, Yeah, like every, students I have, especially in like the prison abolition class I teach, which are like, like attracts a lot of trans students of color, are like, I can't live here anymore. I'm living on the couch of my grandmother. She lives 2 hours away, so I might miss class a lot. And it's really hard to like, in the way of intersectionality, index that into data, because that's not the way it's trying to manage you. It's not trying to manage power, because power is what's targeting you. It's what's producing you, is not being able to make it to class. And so like that would be, I don't know if that is answering your question. Sorry, I'm trying to talk. I already talk fast, but I'm trying to talk fast so I don't take up all the time with my talkativeness. And the social media thing, I'll just say, oh, the reposted. Sorry, I'll really quickly answer that one. I think social media's expansion and creating new keeps the movements in only wave of trend. But I think that's definitely true. And that kind of goes to the visibility. I mean, I think, but it's also, I think again, it kind of, I think accessibility goes another way that way too, right? Like where we tend to conflate what actually is accessibility is each other. Like I think it's Mia Mingus that says accessibility is another word for love, or someone says that. Is there or them? And like I think it's funny with things like social. I mean, it's not funny, but like one of the issues with things like social media specifically, not necessarily online in general. I mean, the internet used to be kind of the opposite of what social media is. Used to be more covert and things like that, right? I think, or maybe I'm idealizing it when I watch my brother use the computer, but as a kid, I think there is a way in which it's kind of actually, and this is just like a very general point about social media, it's actually reproduced the opposite. Like we are actually less accessible to one another in a lot of ways, because of the models of social media that kind of manage us as like a hashtag or something is a really good example. And they don't deepen our attack. They don't inherently, and one can, like there's autonomy, like Stuart Hall said, in these systems, but like one can produce the deepening of our accessibility to one another, our love one another. But I think it's a lot harder given the way I think you called the simulacrum, the informational simulacrum operates, which you could just say is a hashtag, among other things, or Black Lives Matter, as we saw, which okay, that's my answer, because I know I talk really fast and loud. So I'm going to go back to Eric, and Eric is who you came here to see.
No. Yeah, so maybe I'll start with the racial capitalism mutual aid question, which is, thank you for that. I mean, I think perhaps what I'm trying to describe in this, I'm not actually even sure if it's technically mutual aid. I think I'm actually describing like scams, and maybe that's something different. And, I think can grow alongside with, perhaps intersect, perhaps do something else to mutual aid, but it's just like, that's why like what I'm thinking about is like impossible to turn into a politics. I mean, I am actually like arguing against the political at the end of this book. And so, I'm just kind of fairly humbly attempting to describe a practice that's already in existence all over the place, and is actually really beautiful, and something that, again, I don't want to like turn it into a concept or turn it into some kind of reified object. I'm just, this end is kind of like a love letter, because I think that it's also important, right? The book is like really intense and it's about a lot of forms of violence, but there's something about like persistence and a non kind of transcendent form that, stays in the place of totalizing violence, and yet kind of like wiggles its way sideways nonetheless. Like there's something about that I'm just trying to stay with. And I think in particular in the end, which is a little bit, I'd say it's more polemic, but then I'm always polemic, so not really. That's really what I'm attempting to think with. So it's just like a very small scale. It's not like you should do this. It's not like this is like the model for X, Y, and Z. It's like, this is like this practice that keeps people alive. And, that's something. And then the question, I mean, I think Jemma answered it in a similar way that I would around data and, and also AI and biometrics. And of course, there's all kinds of really violent ways. If you get put in jail and and they can't fingerprint you on the biometric, right? It's all like, you call it? It's all not analog anymore. And right, so if they can't fingerprint you, then you could be held for longer or something like that. You like that? So there's all kinds of very material ways that the inability to be kind of logged and captured by the state form of biometric algorithms has material consequences? Yes, definitely. And then I think the answer to that is being given to us is that, well, of course, we just need to sharpen those tools. We need the democratization of AI so that, you know, none of us will, you know, not be able to be cataloged by the state. And of course, there's so much money in that too, because that's what tech wants us to think is the answer to the, you know, massive violence that it produces, is we just need more massive violence. You know, and we see all kinds of people like this grift that people are jumping on, and there's every kind of democratization of AI project with like hundreds of millions is just flowing everywhere. Right. And so I take a kind of prison abolitionist analysis of that. And I'm like, you know, do we want better AI, or do we want the end in that form, the end of AI, right? So that part, and then, yeah, with data, I mean, I think that what Jemma already answered it, the ways in which, you know, data can be, especially in an institution like a university, can be really important because it can allow us to create certain kind of knowledge claims that are in and of themselves a certain kind of performance. And so that's necessary. At the same time, I think they fundamentally work to kind of protect the institution that's producing them. And again, to kind of disallow us from asking the questions about what we actually want and need, and disallow us from building the world that we want and need, right? Instead of cataloging data around who's unhoused, what if we just had housing?
That is a beautiful way to end, a powerful way to end. I feel so grateful that we could have the two of you. It's just been such a rich time, and I'm so grateful to this entire audience. I'm mostly sorry that we don't have an actual room to be in and a place to dine afterwards, but I'm so glad that we had what we did. Thank you both so much for your time and energy. Thank all of you for your questions and your presence. And this will be archived on our website at cssc.berkeley.edu. But with that, thank you so much. Have a great evening, everyone. Take care.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.